Hello, and welcome to Module 2 of Practical Measurement. This unit focuses on appropriateness. And appropriateness is about whether and how we define what is being measured, and whether we can agree on a common definition of how and why we're measuring a certain construct or competency. So when we think about measuring children's learning and development outcomes, there are many big, broad domains we can consider. Things like children's physical well-being, like their gross and fine motor skills, maybe their sexual health. We can also think about their mental health, depression, anxiety. The third is we can think about their cognitive functioning, so whether they're able to pay attention and make decisions and plan for the future. You could also think about their academic skills. So maybe their literacy, whether they're able to read with fluency and comprehend what they're reading, or even their numeracy skills, whether they're able to manipulate numbers and do simple operations. We can also think about children's social and emotional learning, so whether they're able to understand their own emotions, the emotions of others, and whether they're able to make and keep strong relationships. You can also think about children's values, their morals, their spirituality, so maybe things like their attitudes towards gender equity, and maybe even their respect for diversity. Within each of these broad developmental domains, there are several things that we can measure. And that is the focus of appropriateness. Appropriateness is about defining those things very clearly and defining the dimension of those things so that we appropriately measure them. So there are four main questions that we focus on when we talk about appropriateness. And I'm going to use an example from my own work to talk through them. A few years ago, I was working with a team that was focused on an arts-based psychosocial program for children who were living in a refugee camp in the Middle East. When I sat down with the team and asked them what they wanted to measure, they talked about very broad constructs, things like resilience and well-being. And over several weeks, we went over each of these questions to discuss what could actually be an appropriate measurement initiative. The first question is, what do you want to measure? Now, one way to narrow down on what you want to measure is that within each of those competency domains is to think about four different types of things you can measure. One is knowledge. What does the child know? The second is skills. What does the child know how to do? You could also think about attitudes. What does the child believe? Or their behaviors and practices. How do they actually do things? So in any program, and this is a gross generalization, but I think it's helpful to think about. In the near term, the thing that changes first is probably knowledge, then skills, and based on that, we can change children's attitudes. Over time, as children incorporate those knowledge, skills, and attitudes, that changes how children actually act in different situations, changing their behaviors and practices. So in that arts-based psychosocial program, when we first started, the team defined almost 15 or 16 different competency domains to measure. And as we started talking about it, we slowly narrowed it down to 6 that we thought would actually change in the near term over the 12 weeks of that program. And all 6 were either knowledge or skills. The next thing to talk about is, why are you measuring this? Why are you measuring these specific skills or knowledge or attitudes or behaviors instead of something else? And one way to do this is to map your curriculum or your program and figure out what are the actual things that you think will change for children. Another way to do it is to look at your log frame or your theory of change and see if there's anything mentioned in there. You can also look at broad external frameworks or other people's programs to see what the sector is measuring and doing. One way that we did it with the arts-based psychosocial program was that we used focus group discussions that the team had done with parents, teachers, and children in previous iterations of the program. And we used that data to draw out the main things that participants were telling us were changing for them in their own lives. And we designed measures around those 6 things. The next thing to consider is, how will you actually go about measuring these specific skills or knowledge or attitudes or behaviors? When we talk about this, there are many different types of measurement initiatives that we can take up. There are 5 main that I would like to focus on. One is tracking. This is also called formative assessment. This is when a teacher or an educator or a parent does a short assessment and then uses that data to change the way they interact with the child or change their instruction to children. This often requires a very quick turnaround of data. The second is screening. This is where we either diagnose children or we place children into different levels of programs or decide if children are ready for a certain program based on the information that we get from the assessment. Oftentimes, screening assessments are very sensitive to developmental differences and are designed for that specific purpose. The third is very common. It's a situation analysis, often called a needs assessment, and it's done at a broad level, so a population level or a regional level, and oftentimes the assessments are short and meant to be done with a lot of children very quickly. The fourth is monitoring. This is normally done after you've done an impact evaluation or after you've done an evaluation and you've proved the program works. Then, if you get another round of funding, maybe year on year, you measure the same outcome with the same kind of child to understand, are they meeting that benchmark that was set by the impact evaluation? The last is an evaluation. This is where you use a tool longitudinally, so maybe a pre-test and a post-test, and normally with some kind of comparison or control group. And oftentimes this is looking at either the effect or the impact of the program. This is where we were with that arts-based psychosocial program. The team wanted to do a very small study with a pre-test and a post-test with a small comparison group to see if things were actually changing for children who were part of the program. The last question to focus on is who will actually use the results from this measurement that you're doing? And we can think about these 5 different measurement initiatives to actually think about who would use the results. When we think about tracking, the results are directly used very, very soon by educators, parents, or teachers, the user of the tool itself. And so what that means is that any program or initiative or strategy that we have has to be mapped very closely to the data, and the user has to be trained on how to make decisions about what to do with the data. Screening data is normally used to make decisions to track children into different programs. What this means is that it's important for the screening criteria to be very transparent, so partners don't feel slighted based on where children are placed. But it's also very important to realize that screening or diagnosing children could lead to stigmatization of children. And so putting into place measures that make sure that children aren't stigmatized because of the screening process itself is important. When we get to situation analyses, this data is often used at a policy level to make resource allocation decisions. And so one thing that's important is to make and be very clear about what benchmarks or thresholds will be used and how decisions will be made and what the policy implication of different decisions could be. We also think about monitoring, and it's very similar to situation analyses, but at a programmatic level. So it's important to make decisions about what benchmarks or thresholds will be used and how the data will actually be reported and what decisions will be taken. Lastly, when we come to an evaluation, generally it's very, very important, and I've found this very important in my own work, to discuss what can and cannot be said about your findings beforehand. And this is where we were with that arts-based psychosocial program. The team wanted to do a small study, which wasn't very large, even though the sample was not large enough to make generalized decisions about the entire population of students who were going through a similar kind of program. But also we only had a small comparison group and not a control group that was chosen randomly. And so one important thing that we did was have a discussion early on about what could and could not be said with what data we were collecting and what we would find. The team very quickly understood that we could not make causal claims about the effect of the program because our study did not support that. And so having that discussion made them very comfortable with language around looking at the trends in changes in the lives of children. So as you leave this unit, a few things that I'd like you to take away. One is that all people involved, all the partners, whether they're at a senior leadership level, whether they're a policymaker, whether they're a practitioner, should have a common understanding of these 4 questions, the what, why, and how, and who questions of measurement. The second is that answering these questions is an iterative process. Oftentimes we have an initial meeting where we make decisions, but there's no follow-up on those decisions or that discussion throughout the project or program period. And it's important to have these discussions iteratively over the whole period, because as more data or information comes in, some of our information around these questions might change. And so we need to not only have the initial discussion, but revisit those questions as we move along. And the last takeaway is that discussions and consensus building around these 4 questions takes time and takes effort. It's not a one-off process that can be done back and forth over email. It requires several conversations, often over several weeks and going into several months, depending on the decisions you want to make.